Good evening. I'm Haley Ficuciello. Tonight we step back from the noise and look clearly at what just happened and why it matters. Over the past several days, much of the national media conversation was focused on whether President Trump's military action against Iran was legal, reckless, or politically motivated. Democratic leaders in Congress are already moving to limit his authority. But before we get lost in rhetoric, let's ask a simpler and more serious question. Is the United States safer today than it was just last Friday? That question requires context, not headlines. The conflict between the United States and the Iranian regime did not begin this week. It did not begin this year. It began in 1979, during the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis that reshaped the Middle East geopolitics. For nearly 5 decades, Iran's ruling structure has supported proxy groups, funded regional militias, and positioned itself in direct opposition to American influence in the region. Over those decades, Washington's response has followed a familiar path: sanctions, negotiations, limited forces, diplomatic pauses, and renewed tension. In 2015, the Obama administration negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. The agreement placed restrictions on uranium enrichment levels and the centrifuge operation. It imposed inspection mechanisms and temporarily constrained aspects of Iran's nuclear program. But many of those restrictions were time-bound. Key provisions were designed to phase out over time, the so-called sunset clauses. Supporters argued the deal brought time. Critics argued it postponed a structural problem rather than eliminating it. What cannot be disputed is that the agreement did not permanently dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure. It limited and delayed aspects of it. Then came the financial dimension. In 2016, the United States settled a long-standing dispute involving frozen Iranian assets, transferring approximately $400 million in principal and roughly $1.3 billion in interest, totaling about $1.7 billion. Those funds were described as Iranian assets held in trust. But the policy decision nevertheless restored significant liquidity to the regime. Years later, under Biden administration, approximately $6 billion in frozen Iranian funds were cleared for transfer to Qatar under humanitarian use restriction as a part of a prisoner exchange framework. Again, officials emphasized those were Iranian funds, not U.S. taxpayer dollars. But the broader strategic question remains: did expanded financial access produce measurable changes in Iran's behavior? Iran continued advancing enrichment capacity. It continued supporting proxy forces. It continued regional power projections. That brings us to present. On February 28th of 2026, the United States and Israel carried out a coordinated airstrike on Iranian targets. According to Israel, Iran state media, multiple major international outlets, and other global sources, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in the strike. His death marked the end of more than 3 decades as Iran's highest authority. Reports also indicated multiple senior Iranian officials were eliminated during the opening phase of the operation, significantly degrading elements of the regime's leadership structure. Iran has since moved to establish an interim leadership council as succession unfolds. This is not a minor tactic shift. It represents a fundamental change in strategic landscape. For decades, Iran's approach towards the West was guided by a stable, centralized leadership structure that survived sanctions, diplomacy, and political transitions in Washington. Now, That structure faces disruption at its highest level. Critics of President Trump argues the action risks escalation. Supporters argue that deterrence requires credibility, and that credibility sometimes requires decisive forces after diplomacy has been exhausted. The war power resolution requires notification within 48 hours of introducing forces into hostility and establish a 60-day clock absent authorization. It does not mandate advance permission for limited military action. Legal debate will continue. Political debate will intensify. But separate from politics is the reality of what changed. For nearly half a century, Iran's regime operated under continuity at its very top. That continuity is now gone. The strategy of delay, of sunset provision, and incremental containment did not permanently resolve the threat. This operation has altered the leadership calculus in Tehran, and that is why this moment is so consequential. Democratic lawmakers are entitled to question processes. That is their constitutional role. But Americans are also entitled to ask whether repeated cycles of negotiation without permanent structural change have delivered lasting security. History shows that deterrence is not measured by statements, it is measured by consequences. President Trump's supporters argue he gave diplomacy every opportunity, and when it failed to yield lasting results, he acted. His critics argue the risks are high. Both arguments will continue, but what is beyond debate is this. The strategic equation today is different than it was days ago, and after nearly 5 decades of managing, rather than resolving, the Iranian challenges, that difference matters. I'm Haley Ficuciello, and this has been my commentary for Englebrook Independent News.